You turn, you put your hand in the fin.
This is my 22 Volkswagen GLI. 3 years ago, I bought this car new, and since then I have done a lot of mods to it. The car currently makes 450 wheel horsepower, and I have learned a lot along the way. Today, I want to share my experiences, what I have learned with you guys, and hopefully make it easier for the people that are new to the platform to understand exactly what goes into modifying one of these cars to make this type of power level, and cover a lot of different things such as, just the basics, fundamentals of tuning these cars, what you need to know as far as mods go, and pretty much everything in between. So let's get into it. If you guys are new to the channel, my name is John. I've been making videos for about 1.5 years now, and I started modifying my GLI a little bit before then, but this is really the first car that I have ever started to modify. It's the first car I bought new, and I've learned a lot. I'm pretty active on the Facebook communities for this platform, and I see this question asked all the time. I want to get into tuning, but I don't know where to start, and that's what I hope to answer for you guys today. So let's just get into the basics. What is tuning? How does it work? What does it do? What is the whole shebang, right? I think the most important thing to start off with is off-the-shelf tuning versus custom tuning. What's the difference? So an off-the-shelf tune is essentially a pre-made tune for your car. That is going to be a lot of times what you hear referred to as like a stage 1 tune, a stage 2 tune, stage 1 IS38, stage 2 IS38, stage 3 IS38, or anything in between. These are tunes that essentially you can just flash straight onto your car without really having to worry about it. It's going to work for you regardless of what elevation you're at, where you're at in the world, and just it takes into account a lot of environmental factors to make sure that your car is going to run well on those stage tunes. This is typically where a lot of people start and maybe not end, because like in my case, for example, I started off with the integrated engineering stage 1 tune and stage 2 tune. Eventually I switched to the EQT stage 2 tune, and now I'm custom tuned through EQT. Now a custom tune is a bit different in the sense that the tune is really made specifically for your car. And this is done through things like data logging, street logs, dyno logs, basically just sending information back to the tuners so that way they can make adjustments and calibrations to your car. And it's a lot more process heavy, and it doesn't typically make a lot of sense for setups that already have like an off-the-shelf configuration. But for now, let's kind of just start with the basic overview of off-the-shelf tunes. Before we get into that, let's make 2 things clear here. This information that I'm going to share with you guys is pretty generalized, and I'm going to really be comparing 3 tuners, which is EQT, integrated engineering, and APR for this example in this video. There are several other stage tuners and custom tuners out there, but we'll dive more into that later. Let's just get into it, right? Starting off, a lot of times what you're gonna hear people do is a stage 1 tune for their GLI or GTI or whatever. And typically that means that the car is stock hardware. There is some exceptions, like sometimes, either in cold air intake or a catback exhaust. That's generally kind of the max that you wanna have for a stage 1 tune, because they're supposed to be for stock hardware. And this is something that you can literally just flash onto your car, add a little bit of power, and enjoy it. It is important to know too that when you are doing a tune like this, you typically want either a DSG transmission tune also, or if you have a manual car, you're going to want an upgraded clutch. Now, stage 2 is kind of where things get a little bit more murky, because the main requirement for stage 2 tune is going to be an aftermarket downpipe. Like for example, here's my CTS downpipe that I have on my GLI. That is going to make a huge difference in terms of airflow that is going to be able to be exhausted out of the vehicle. And so that's why a new tune file is, required for that type of setup. Typically, you're also going to want an intercooler and also like an intake, maybe even a turbo inlet pipe, and also a catback if you can do it. Pretty much you're just trying to maximize the flow efficiency both in the turbo and out of the turbo. Now, stage 1 and stage 2 is pretty much what a lot of people would be like, oh yeah, I got stage 2, I got pops and bangs, and like, it's a very common, popular setup choice for a lot of people. From here, you pretty much have the option to do a couple couple of different things typically with off-the-shelf tunes. One example of this would be the IS38 turbo upgrade. Now, my car has a Vortex hybrid turbo, which we will talk about when we get to the custom tuning portion, but essentially the IS38 turbo is the factory turbo that comes on the Golf R and S3, and it can be bolted right up to a GLI, a GTI, and A3, because those cars have an IS20 turbo. It's basically like the little sibling brother to the IS38. IS38 has a little bit more top end flow and boost range, we'll call it something like that. It's going to basically allow for more top end airflow. The IS20 really kind of starts to die off around like 4,500, 5,000 RPM, and the IS38 typically holds it a little bit higher. Like I said, it's the factory turbo on the Golf R and S3, and it's the same exact motor for the most part, so those turbos bolt right up. And a lot of companies like EQT, IE, APR, they have tune files that are off the shelf, ready to go onto your car that account for that larger turbo upgrade. You can typically run an IS38 turbo with either like a stage 1 or stage 2 configuration, but really if you're going to run it in a stage 1 configuration, you want pretty much all the parts of a stage 2 setup, like a turbo inlet pipe intake, cap back, but you don't need the downpipe because that is a stage 1 tune. Just kind of keep that in mind. You can run an IS38 with or without a downpipe, but you will get a little bit more extra power out of having that downpipe. It just kind of depends on where you are and what your emission laws look like and all that fun stuff, One other thing I want to touch on real quick is that when you are adding power to these cars, you do also want to upgrade other things, not just in the engine bay, but also, things like engine and transmission mounts, dog bone inserts, pendulum mounts. All those things can also really help, because once you start adding power, you're going to run into issues with like wheel hop, for example, where the wheels won't be able to get traction, and you need to have a little bit more of a stiff setup on the car so that way you're able to put the power down nicely. In general, get better tires. Like the stock tires that come on these cars suck, especially when you're adding power. You're going to want good tires to be able to get traction. Now we'll get into power and stuff in a second, but I do also kind of want to touch on fuel types. Now generally for most people in the US, you're going to have 91 or 93 octane available to you, and when you're tuning a car for those octanes, it's important that you're actually using that. Don't go use 87 if you have a 93 tune, for example. And to that point, you can also run ethanol in these cars, whether that be an ethanol tune that's like for E85 or ethanol 30, like ethanol content of 30%, or flex fuel, just kind of depending on who you're tuned with and what your tune file and what your hardware setup looks like. So for example, EQT offers E30 tunes, which can be basically run stock fueling hardware, which is basically saying that you have 30% ethanol content in your tank, or you can do like an E85 tune, which is full E85 in your tank, or you can run flex fuel. With integrated engineering, for example, they only offer flex fuel. Now, flex fuel is great, and honestly, in a perfect world, you should always have flex fuel, but let's say you have a stage 2 car, intake, intercooler, downpipe, and the tune file. You would be able to essentially get a new tune file for E30, and then when you go to the gas pump, you would blend down your ethanol. With the stock fueling, you can actually get a lot more power out of just an E30 tune. There's apps for this. I'll try to link one in the description that I've heard people use. If you're wanting to run, like full E85, for example, you would need to upgrade your high pressure fuel pump on your car. And if you wanted to run flex fuel, you'll typically need a high pressure fuel pump and a flex fuel harness. The flex fuel harness is basically going to read the ethanol content in the car and will tell the ECU, hey, this is how much ethanol content we have. This is how much we need to adjust the ECU parameters to be able to comfortably run the car and make sure that nothing goes wrong. Now, I know that all sounds complicated, but really the important thing to know here is that the cicadas are super loud. See, they quiet down now. Anyways, the important thing to know here is that ethanol basically can allow your car to make a lot more power with the same hardware configuration, assuming you have appropriate fueling mods, if that makes sense. So this is what a ethanol content sensor, flex sensor looks like. Basically taps into your fuel line, you run some wires back to your ECU and tell it, hey, this is how much ethanol we have in the tank, and this is our, fuel stuff. This is what we need to do to make the car run good. I haven't installed this yet, I just have it sitting here, so I figured I'd show you guys. Now, let's kind of get into power for stage tune configurations. These are just averages that I kind of pulled between IE, EQT, and APR pretty much. So just take this all with a grain of salt and know that depending on where you live, your elevation, your fuel quality, and things like that, whether you're on 91 or 93, it's going to vary a little bit. So just, like I said, take this with a grain of salt. So for stage 1 IS20 stock turbo, on 93, you're going to be looking at around 280 to 290 wheel horsepower with 340 to 350 wheel torque. On E85, E60, E70, you know, that range, you're going to be looking at around 330 to 340 wheel horsepower with 360 to 390 wheel torque. Now, stock, these cars make about 220 wheel horsepower and like 260 wheel torque, I think. If it's wrong, I'll throw it up right here. But so you get a good bump just over stock using a regular pump gas stage 1 tune or a ethanol stage 1 tune. For stage 1 with IS38 upgrade, you're going to be looking at around 340 to 370 wheel horsepower with 360 to 400 wheel torque on 93. And then on E60, E70, E85, you're going to be looking at around 330 to 340 wheel horsepower with 360 to 390 wheel torque. For stage 2 IS20, you're going to be looking at around 300 to 320 wheel horsepower, 350 to 370 wheel torque on 93. And on ethanol, same thing, E60, E70, blah, 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 blah. You're going to be looking at around 350 to 360 wheel horsepower with 380 to 400 wheel torque. On stage 2 IS38, you're going to be looking at around 345 to 370 wheel horsepower and 370 to 400 wheel torque. On ethanol, you're going to be looking at around 390 wheel horsepower to 400 and 410-ish wheel torque, somewhere around there. Now, IE and APR do also have a little bit of a higher level for stage tune configurations because they don't offer custom tuning like EQT does, for example. So with integrated engineering, you can also run what's called a 2260 turbo, and you can use their stage configurations. And on 93, you'd be looking at around 390 to 400 wheel horsepower with 390 to 400 wheel torque. Now, given that IE only really supports like a high pressure pump and flex fuel harness, you're going to be pretty much limited to about E30 with their flex fuel kit and stuff. And that's going to be right about 420 wheel horsepower over 415 wheel torque. APR does also offer a DTR 6054 turbo kit, and on 93 that makes 400 to 410 wheel horsepower and 380 to 390 wheel torque. They also offer an EFR turbo kit that makes 430, 440 wheel horsepower and 400 to 410 wheel torque. Now let's kind of go over the costs associated with those types of configurations. So this is just a really rough estimate and doesn't really include sale prices. It also just kind of assumes that you're starting stock and getting into a certain tuning ecosystem and you're building the car over time. So with that being said, assuming you're going to run 91 or 93 octane at first, this is kind of what you're looking at. For a stage 1 tune, depending on who you go with, you're going to be in the neighborhood of $1,300 to $1,500 if you have a DSG. Now, if you don't have a DSG, that means you don't need a transmission tune, and that means you're going to be looking at around $700 to $1,000. However, if you have a manual, you are also going to want a clutch, which pretty much balances itself out. That is pretty much just for the dongle that you might need to tune or an access port and the tune files for that configuration for your car. For stage 2, this is where things start to add up because you are probably not stock hardware. You are going to want, at least the recommended mods, the required mods, obviously, and you're probably going to want a little bit more here or there. So take this number with a grain of salt. But generally a tune file upgrade, going from stage 1 to stage 2, if you're staying in that ecosystem, whether that be EQT, IE, APR, whatever, you're going to spend about $100 to $200 on that tune file. A downpipe is going to run you between $300 and $600. An intercooler will be between $500 and $900, depending on if you go with a front mount, a direct replacement like I did. Whatever you end up getting, it's going to vary a bit. Intake, turbo inlet pipe, things like that, somewhere between $400 and $700, just kind of depending on what kind you get, whether you get carbon, plastic, etc., etc. A catback, it is nice to get a little bit extra flow, and it is typically a good quality exhaust. That's going to run you between like $800, $1,200, could be less, could be more, just kind of depends. So jumping from stage 1 to stage 2 and doing pretty much all of those mods, you're going to be looking at between $2,100 and $3,600 on top of the cost of getting into that ecosystem, like I mentioned earlier, for the stage 1 tune. Now, if you're jumping up to IS38, you're going to be spending about another $100, $200 for a tune file, and you're also going to be spending between $900 and $1,200, excuse that fly there, for the turbo itself. So if you're going stock to stage 2 IS38, you'd be looking in the neighborhood of $3,500 to $6,500, not including, you know, whether you buy items on sale, and also just depending on what quality and level of parts you end up deciding on. If you're adding ethanol capabilities, you know, plan between $300 to $400 for a high pressure fuel pump upgrade, so that way you can run ethanol at a content greater than E30 on stock turbo. Account about another $200 to $300 for a flex fuel sensor, putting you about an extra $500 to $700 for ethanol or flex capabilities. Now, honorable mentions. If you wanted to skip IS38 and go to something like the IE2260, you'd be spending about $1,600 on their turbo upgrade. For the APR DTR 6054 kit, you'd be looking at about $2,100, and the APR EFR kit would be about $5,000. So going from IS38 to a different turbo stage tune configuration is a good bit more money. It just kind of depends on what ecosystem you're in and what your goals are. That also doesn't include costs like the dog bone insert, pendulum mounts, engine mounts, transmission mounts, anything like that that you would also want to normally have, especially when you start pushing higher power levels. Now, this is where things start to get a little bit sticky, and this is custom tuning. This is something that is a little bit more of a higher level, I'd call it, but there's a lot of customization, a lot of flexibility, and things like that that I think are important to know when you start getting into higher power levels like this, or if you're even considering going into a higher power level like, you know, 450 wheel horsepower. So up until this point, the tuners that we have talked about, except for EQT, none of them offer custom tuning on this vehicle. Now, custom tuning you can get done from a bunch of different companies like, you know, EQT, Russell Road Racing, GLS, Galano, local shops near you. If you have a good one, they might be able to even do it too. And essentially custom tuning is, like I mentioned earlier, it's making a tune specific for your vehicle, your environment, your fuel types, just everything about your car, a tune specifically for that. There's a lot you can do with it. It typically works by doing what's called a data log. Now, this is where you're going to take a log of your vehicle, maybe doing a third gear pull from 2000 RPM to red line, sending it back to your tuner. They're gonna look at it, adjust some stuff, send it back to you, you're gonna flash it on, and repeat that process until your tune is very, very nicely refined for your car. You can also do this on the dyno and or street, and I kind of did a combination of both when I did my custom tune, because doing fourth gear wide open pulls in a 450 wheel horsepower car is scary, I'll be honest, because it's like top speed of felonies. So why would someone do a custom tune over something like a stage tune? And the answer is really just your goals and what your setup is on your car and how you want the car to behave and feel and all those things. As I mentioned earlier, my car has an EQT Vortex turbo, which is a hybrid turbo setup. I have 5-bar boost sensors. I have an RS3 low pressure fuel pump, high pressure fuel pump, intake, intercooler, radiator, bunch of other stuff on this car that people typically don't support with off-the-shelf tunes. So if I want the car to run right, I need a custom tune. With that being said, it also gives me a lot more room for growth and, you know, adding mods as I go. Right now, the car is on 93. When I plan on adding MPI, multi-port injection, in the future, I will be able to run ethanol and flex fuel and all these great things that just wouldn't be possible on a staged off-the-shelf tune. It's way too specific and there's way too many variables that go into each car when you're trying to make power like this. But custom tuning basically will give you that flexibility to be able to run literally whatever setup you want, whether you're running a EQT Vortex like I am, you're running a DBV2 turbo, you're running a TPC turbo, you know, anything like that, or you have an upgraded intake manifold or multi-port injection or fuel pumps, like whatever you want, you'll be able to run it with your setup. Now, you're probably wondering how expensive is custom tuning. It's a lot more expensive. You know, like I said, a typical stage tune upgrade going from like stage 1 to stage 2 is going to be like $200. A custom tune is going to run you between like $800 to $1,500. You also have to account for things like shop time, dyno time. Not to mention, typically when you're doing a custom tune, your car's setup is more unique and there's more parts to it, and those parts can often be a lot more expensive also. If you are planning on tuning one of these cars, I think it's also important that you know kind of like the stock power limits of the stock engine in these cars. And they are really good, to be honest. Like, you can typically run about 550 to 600 wheel horsepower and run, you know, about 430 to 450 wheel torque before you really start stressing the block. But anything over that, you should probably invest in a built motor just so you don't blow your shit to the moon. Now, that pretty much covers the tuning portion of this, but I do also want to give you guys some additional advice that I have learned over the years and kind of just my takeaways from tuning. The first thing being that warranty. Warranty will not exist when you tune your car. That's somewhat true, somewhat false. It just kind of depends on who you ask and what dealership you go to. Some dealerships are cool with tunes, some aren't. Some by me were like, yeah, if you change out your tires, your entire car's warranty is voided. Or excuse me, not tires, wheels. And then another one was like, yeah, you can do an intake, cat back, and like, it's not an issue. My advice to you, but don't give them your name, don't give them your VIN or anything, but just kind of call and be like, yo, can I tune my car? Will that void my warranty? Call around your dealerships, see what they say, and just kind of try to see for yourself, kind of, because there's really not a clear answer because all of them are a little bit different. But the general consensus that I understand is that if the modification you made somehow damaged that component that you're trying to have replaced under warranty, that's when warranty is typically voided. So it just really depends. And with things like powertrain and tuning, like, it definitely gets more murky. Another thing I kind of want to mention is also emissions. If you have an aftermarket downpipe, chances are you're not going to pass emissions. And there are emissions compliant downpipes like Miltech and Integrated Engineering makes one, but those are also very, very expensive. So just keep that in mind. If you are somewhere that has very strict emissions, maybe a downpipe's not going to be the best option for you, and instead you'll just want to stick to the stock one. It just really depends on where you live. Also, I want to say, make sure that you use your resources. There are so many great GLI and GTI communities on Facebook, and there's plenty of people that are able to help and kind of guide you in the right direction when you have problems. You're not alone in this. There's plenty of people that modify these cars, and there's plenty of people that you can learn from. Honestly, that's how I learned a lot in the beginning, especially. The last main big thing I want to talk about in regards to tuning is that make sure that you're buying once and crying once. There's plenty of times where I tried to cheap out on stuff and it's bit me in the ass. Like, for example, I did lowering springs and now I have a set of coilovers back there that we're going to be putting on the car soon. Spoiler. Or like having to upgrade my intake because the APR intake is pretty restrictive once you go to a hybrid turbo setup. Invest in quality parts and, you know, choose a tuner that's going to allow for your upgrade path as best as possible. You know, if you want to potentially go hybrid turbo or do some crazy stuff in the future, definitely pick a tuner that has custom tuning as an option, so you're not having to go buy two different tuning ecosystems. That's something I also did. But that's really the biggest things. I just kind of wanted to make this video to explain to you guys, you know, how exactly tuning works, what are some of your options if you're getting into these cars and into the platform, and just trying to help answer some of the questions that I asked myself whenever I got started on this car about 3 years ago. But if you found this video helpful and you're new to the platform, I also made a video about my 5 favorite first mods to do on the car, and I'll link that right up there or down below, and or both. And make sure you guys go check that out because it might be helpful for you guys. I don't know. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed, make sure you like, comment, subscribe. Otherwise, you won't get a cookie today. So, peace out.